For 25 years, from 1443 to 1468, Skanderbeg's 10,000 marched through Ottoman territory, winning against consistently larger and better supplied Ottoman forces. In this video we will talk about the origins of the House of Kastrioti and the unification of the Albanian Principalities. In addition of the early wars with Venice and all the main battles from Torvioll in 1444 to the fourth and final siege of Kruja in 1478. Skanderbeg was one of the most formidable foes faced by Ottoman Empire throughout its history. Militarily, the Albanian lord accomplished what few in the Balkans could, halting the peak Ottoman expansion throughout Europe for over 2 decades, as the Ottomans missed a prime opportunity to conquer Albania and much of Italy. So, sit back and enjoy. This is the untold history of Gjergj Kastrioti, better known as Skanderbeg. For the last century, the various lords and rulers of Albania had often played off with their powerful neighbors, like the Venetians, Serbians, and the Ottomans against one another, in order to maintain their autonomy. However, since the reign of Mehmed I, Ottoman interest in taming the mountains of Albania became evident, as more and more military campaigns were launched into the region. The political chaos of the early years of the 15th century further worsened the political, social, and economic crisis in Albania. The trend toward centralization had continued, despite the Venetian efforts to halt it. As a result of these conflicts among the Albanian nobility, 3 large principalities dominated central and northern Albania. The Ducat genus in the north, the Kastrioti in the north-central part of the country, and the Arianiti in the central area. After establishing his control over the Ottoman state, Sultan Mehmed launched a campaign against Albania in 1415, reasserting Ottoman authority over the central and southern parts of the country. In the south, the Timar system was extended, resulting in many Albanian noble families losing their lands and titles. While in the central part of the country, the aristocracy maintained their lands by paying tribute and sending their sons as hostages to the Ottoman court. As no exceptions were given to the Kastrioti family, Gjergj became one of these hostages at a young age, in order to receive a full Ottoman education, with hopes of turning him into a useful military general. During his stay in Adrianople, Gjergj converted to Islam, and took the name Skander, meaning Alexander. By the time he graduated from the entrance school, Gjergj had already begun to earn himself an impressive reputation, as both trustworthy and skillful when it came to the military. As a result, the Sultan granted him fiefs in Macedonia and northern Bulgaria. By this point, Gjergj had also begun to be known by his famous nickname, Skanderbeg, which can be translated as Lord Alexander from Turkish. Skanderbeg likely participated during the siege of Thessalonica, which led his own unit, totaling roughly 5,000 cavalry, in the name of the Sultan. The expansion of Ottoman authority over the region led to widespread revolts in central Albania, as Turkish Sipahis came to claim their Timars. Andre Thopia, a noble displaced by Murad's invasion, led the first major revolt, which defeated a small Turkish detachment. His victory encouraged other notable leaders, and the revolt spread throughout Albania. Gjergj Arianiti, who was living at the Ottoman court as a hostage, was called by rebels to lead the revolt in his family's domains. In response, he fled from Edirne and returned to Albania. In the winter of 1432, Sultan Murad gathered around 10,000 troops under Ali Bey, who marched along the Egnatia and reached the central valley of Shkumbin. However, Ali Bey was ambushed and defeated by the forces under Gjergj Arianiti. His victory prompted the Albanians in the area of Gjirokastra to call upon Dep Zenebishi, who had settled in his estates in Corfu, after the Ottoman conquest of the Principality of Gjirokastra. After spreading the revolt in nearby areas, including Keltsia, Zagori, and Pogan, his forces besieged the southern city of Gjirokastra, the capital of the Sanjak of Albania. The concurrent siege of Gjirokastra was prolonged, and Turahan Bey attacked and defeated the troops that surrounded the city in early of 1433. Zenebishi himself was captured and then executed. In the summer of 1433, an army led by Sinan Pasha, Ballaban of Rumelia, pillaged the areas of Yangnina and moved northwards, where they subdued the rebels in the domains of John Kastrioti, who was reduced again to vassal status. In northern Albania, Nicholas Gjergj captured territories of the pre-Ottoman Principality of Gjergj. Nicole then tried to ally himself with Venice by offering to accept Venetian suzerainty and granting them control of Dagenham. However, Venice refused any kind of involvement in his plan, and the revolt in general. Venice likely feared of a possible Ottoman invasion, and thus did not want to trigger any hostilities with the Turks. Nicole was not aware that Hasan Bey, the Ottoman governor of Dagenham, had requested Venetian assistance after his defeat. As Venice did not want to provoke Ottoman hostility, the captain of the Shkodër garrison was ordered to assist Hasan Bey in recapturing Dagenham from Gjergj. In December of 1434, Ishak Bey marched into south-central Albania to crush the rebellion. Upon knowing this, Gjergj Arianiti moved against him and managed to defeat. Contemporary sources from the Senate of Ragusa mention that many Ottoman soldiers were captured, while Ishak Bey escaped with a small group. In April of 1435, Gjergj defeated another Ottoman campaign, and hostilities virtually ceased until the beginning of 1436, as Murad's military efforts were focused against Ibrahim of Karaman in Anatolia. Despite the military victories, the rebel leaders acted autonomously without a central leadership, the lack of which greatly contributed to their final defeat, as Turahan's forces eventually subdued the revolt, and thus put an end to the rebellion. In order to stabilize Ottoman authority, Murad II appointed native Albanians, like Yakup Bey Muzaka and Skanderbeg, to high positions within the Sanjak of Albania. The nobles who accepted Ottoman overlordship were granted their pre-Ottoman holdings and border estates, as well as a degree of autonomy, while others were exiled. During the period of 1438 and 1443, Skanderbeg is thought to have been fighting alongside the Ottomans in their European campaigns, mostly against the Christian forces led by John Hunyadi. In 1440, Skanderbeg was appointed the Sanjak Bey of Dibra. During his stay in Albania as an Ottoman governor, he maintained close relations with the population and also with other Albanian noble families. In early November of 1443, a large crusading army led by John Hunyadi himself crossed the Ottoman northern borders and was able to rout 3 provincial Ottoman armies near the outskirts of the towns of Niš. Hunyadi had prevented these Ottoman armies from uniting into a larger force, as he defeated them in 3 prompted battles. It was to be after these defeats that Skanderbeg deserted his post and began instigating a significant rebellion back in Albania. He began his rebellion by first capturing the fortress town of Kruja, by tricking its local Turkish garrison into opening their gates with a forged letter from the Sultan. After capturing Kruja, Skanderbeg then held a speech to the local Albanian population, stating that
Liri nuk t'ju apruna unë, ate e gjeta, ja këtu mër ju, mër zemra, rënë të liria atë dhëllë. Manje pra nëllë vllazën, lamurin e Shqipnisë son, tregonje pra trimnin tuj, ashtu si burrat dikur motit. Ma mirë t'biesh luftin, se t'metesh si ë.
After capturing some less important surrounding castles, Skanderbeg raised a red standard with a black double-headed eagle on top of Kruja. Skanderbeg then abandoned Islam and reverted back to Christianity. It was the final action that earned him the nickname Iskender, the traitor, throughout many Muslim circles. On March 2, 1444, Skanderbeg summoned Albanian noblemen in the Venetian-controlled town of Lugja, where they established a military alliance known as the League of Lugja. Back during the rebellions of the 1430s, much of the Albanian nobility had been politically divided, resulting in the more numerous Ottomans systematically defeating each noble houses, one by one. But now, everything was different. The creation of the League was to be the first time a concerted effort was made to form a united Albanian nation. Upon uniting their combined fiscal and military resources, the League members proclaimed Skanderbeg their commander-in-chief and the new Lord of Albania. During the cessation of hostilities with the Crusaders on the summer of 1444, Murad II had sent a provincial army of around 25,000 strong, under the command of his much-trusted general, Ali Pasha, to crush the Albanian revolt. The general's target was the town of Kruja, the center of the rebellion. Mustering 15,000 troops to face his first genuine test as a military leader, Skanderbeg marched northeast to meet the Ottoman host on the narrow plain of Torvioll. During the night before the battle, Skanderbeg stationed 3,000 cavalry under the command of his nephew, House of Kastrioti, where they were hidden behind enemy lines in a nearby forest. By the early hours of June 29, both armies made ready for battle. Using his time serving in the Sultan's armies to his benefit, Skanderbeg stationed his army in a traditional Turkish crescent formation, overlooking the plain in the hopes of flanking around his enemy. The Albanian lord stationed himself in the center, alongside various units of light infantry and archers. Due to the battlefield's narrow terrain, the Turkish army was unable to use its numerical superiority to its advantage, so Ali Pasha organized his host into 3 narrow battle lines. The Ottoman general stationed himself at the center of the Turkish line, alongside a small unit of janissaries. The battle began with the first 2 Ottoman battle lines charging directly into the Albanian army. What ensued was a bloody, but not a decisive melee, in which the Albanians barely held out against the Turkish onslaught. This showcase of bravery and defiance surprised Ali Pasha, so he ordered his reserves into the fray as a means to finish off the rebels. Unbeknownst to him, he was falling right into Skanderbeg's trap. Seeing that his foe had deployed his last remaining troops into the battlefield, the Albanian lord ordered his hidden cavalry in the surrounding forests to charge into the Ottoman rear. In a single action, the entire Turkish army was surrounded. In addition to the surprise cavalry charge, the Albanian crescent formation proved vital in funneling the Turkish host towards the center of the battlefield. What followed was a great massacre of the invader army that saw their leader barely escaping the field of the battle. Around 2/3 of the Ottoman host was killed and/or captured by the end of the day. The Albanian victory drew the attention of the Pope and the governor of Transylvania and Hungary, John Hunyadi, who began to see Skanderbeg as an important element in his future crusades. Seeking revenge for its humiliating defeat at Torvioll, Edirne sent another army into Albania during the fall of 1445, this time led by Firuz Pasha. However, Skanderbeg again defeated this numerically superior army at the Battle of Mokra. This time around, the Turkish army took over 3,000 casualties, which included Firuz Pasha himself. Yet another army was sent into the region a year later, under the command of Mustafa Pasha, but his forces also proved unsuccessful, with Skanderbeg defeating them at the Battle of Ottonet. A contest which resulted in over 5,000 dead Turks. What had initially seemed like a minor and insignificant revolt had turned into a logistical nightmare for an already dysfunctional Ottoman government. In 1445, during a marriage ceremony for Skanderbeg's sister, Mehmed Kastrioti, Zoharia had a dispute with Lek Dukagini. At the center of this dispute was a woman named Irene Dushmani, heir to the Dushmani family. She seemed to have preferred Zoharia, but was not taken well by Nicholas Dukagini. As a result, a skirmish happened, and Dukagini remained wounded, saved only by the intervention of Vrana Conti. 2 years later, in 1447, Lek Zoharia was killed in an ambush, and Lek Dukagini was accused of his death. The death of Zoharia left his princedom with no successor. As a result, his mother handed the fortress over to Venetian Albania, a stretch of possessions of the Republic of Venice. Skanderbeg urged the Venetian legates that Dagenham along with Sati should be restored to the League, since it guarded an important trade route, but Venice refused, and consequently, Skanderbeg declared war against the Republic. The League soon sent envoys to its neighbors, Stefan Krnojević and Đurad Branković. Branković, the despot of Serbia, who was also in dispute with Venice over the Principality of Zeta, expressed his willingness to help Skanderbeg against the Republic. The Venetian sent an ambassador to Skanderbeg offering him 1,000 ducats to lay aside all claims to Dagenham. Skanderbeg, however, refused the offer, and hostilities continued. In December of 1447, after leaving a protective force of 4,000 men under Vrana Conti, in order to guard the frontier in the event of an Ottoman incursion, Skanderbeg turned towards Dagenham with a force of 14,000 men. Initially offering the garrison at Dagenham the opportunity to surrender, he promptly besieged the fortress upon rejection. In order to pressure the Venetians, Skanderbeg also turned towards Durazzo, and cut the city off from their local resources. On March 4 of 1448, a life pension of 100 gold ducats per month was offered to anyone who would assassinate Skanderbeg. Venice also sent Venier to meet with Skanderbeg in order to convince him to break off hostilities, and also attempted to push the Duke of Gjergj away from their alliance with Skanderbeg. Despite measures taken by the Venetians, Skanderbeg marched towards Scutari, unabated. On the 23rd of July, 1448, Skanderbeg crossed the Drin River with 10,000 men, meeting a Venetian force of 15,000 men, under the command of Daniele Urici, governor of Scutari. Skanderbeg managed to defeat and inflict 2,500 casualties on the Venetian force. The Albanian law then retreated from the area to fight off an Ottoman invasion. With Durazzo, Scutari, and Dagenham on the point of surrender, and seeing a victorious Albanian army after the Battle of Arianiti, the Venetians sent Andrea Venier to open peace negotiations with the League. With the Treaty of 1448 at Lugja, Venice agreed to pay Skanderbeg 1,400 ducats annually to retain their hold on Dagenham. One of the reasons Skanderbeg agreed to sign the peace treaty with Venice was the lack of artillery cannons to breach fortresses, and also the crossing of John Hunyadi's army in Kosovo, where the Hungarian regent had invited Skanderbeg to join the expedition against the Sultan. Gjergj had stationed himself as neutral on the following crusade, and refused to join the crusading army, but when John Hunyadi gave his men free license to pillage the Serbian countryside, infuriated the Serbian despot so much that he began to pass on intelligence to the Ottoman Sultan on the whereabouts and the size of the Crusader host. Upon hearing of the crusade, Sultan Murad began moving against Hunyadi's forces. However, the Albanian army under Skanderbeg did not participate in this battle, as he was prevented from uniting with Hunyadi's army. It is believed that he was delayed by Đurađ Branković, as the local Serbian garrison blocked the paths through Kosovo. Skanderbeg was outrageous, as he had been prevented in participating in a battle which could have changed the fate of his homeland, if not the entirety of the Balkan Peninsula. As the Second Battle of Kosovo was to be the last time a concerted effort was made to expel the Ottoman Turks from the Balkans. In contrary, Skanderbeg raided and pillaged Serbian villages in the area, as a punishment for Đurađ for abandoning his Christian allies and preventing him from uniting with Hunyadi's forces. It is May 14, 1448, Sultan Murad II laid siege to the fortress of Svetigrad with an army of 50,000 men. Svetigrad was an important strategic point for the Albanian League, since it controlled the routes from Macedonia into Albania. The small garrison, composed of Albanians, held the fortress under the command of Vrana Conti. However, after the Ottomans poisoned the wells, a group of defenders opened the gates and let the Turks in, thus giving control of the fortress to the Ottomans. In the early of 1450, the city of Berat fell, after a surprise attack was carried by an Ottoman general, causing Gjergj Arianiti to desert Skanderbeg's cause and leave the Albanian League. The morale of the Albanians sank after the losses in the previous years. The Ottoman Sultan wanted to capitulate on this momentum by launching a new campaign into Albania. In 1450, the stage for another major confrontation between Murad and Skanderbeg had become ever so inevitable. Mustering around 50,000 troops for his new Albanian campaign, the Ottoman Sultan chose to strike deep at Kruja. Before the siege began, Skanderbeg exited Kruja with 8,000 men. He found Mount Tumanishta to be a suitable position from which to attack the Ottomans. Kruja was left with a garrison of 2,000 men, under the command of Vrana Conti. Vrana had under his command several Germans, Italians, and Frenchmen, to whom he emphasized the importance of the siege and also ordered them to their positions. Kruja also had enough supplies for a 16-month siege. The women and children of Kruja were sent for protection to Venetian-possessed cities, whereas the local villagers were ordered to burn their crops and move into the mountains and fortresses. With all these Albanian preparations in the background, on May 14, Murad reached Kruja and began its immense preparations for the upcoming siege. Murad then tried to bribe Vrana Conti by offering favorable terms of surrender and lavish bribes, but to no avail. What followed was a significant bombardment of the fortress's walls by the Ottoman artillery. Despite the firepower, the Ottoman firing positions were at a disadvantage, since Kruja was almost part of the mountain which it had been built. Also, the cannons could only fire 2 to 3 times a day, and were not accurate. After 4 days of continuous barrage, a breach was finally made, resulting in the Sultan ordering his troops to advance through the walls of Kruja. Regardless, the garrison managed to fill the breach and push back the invaders. During the same time period, Skanderbeg had launched a surprise attack on the Ottoman camp, killing several hundred men and destroying the Ottoman supplies. When Skanderbeg returned to his men, his shield was so battered that its shape was scarce to be discerned. The raid also cost Skanderbeg 10 dead, and even more wounded. When the second assault began, the Turks tried to break through the gate with their lances. Regardless, that had also failed and resulted in heavy casualties. The Sultan ordered the Sipahi cavalry to withdraw, while for the next 2 days he held a council of all his generals. An immediate precaution was to guard the camp against another surprise Albanian attack, which was responded to by placing a force of men under the command of the Ottoman prince, where the first attack had taken place days before. Moisi Arianiti, one of Skanderbeg's most trusted and capable commanders, feigned an attack with about 500 horsemen. Being alarmed from this attack, the Ottomans prepared for his attack. Meanwhile, Skanderbeg and his forces moved around the camp and broke in where they least expected. Before an organized counterattack could be made, Skanderbeg retreated from the camp. A large force of Turkish cavalry was sent out, which Skanderbeg followed up to the mouth of the Ishem River, until they turned back to Kruja. While Skanderbeg had been away, a large Ottoman assault was made on Kruja. But inadvertent friendly fire from the Ottomans forced them to call off the assault. The Ottomans then attempted to mine the fortress, but could not succeed since the fortress had been built on top of a steep and rocky mountainous ridge. Since the food supplies were also beginning to run out, the Ottomans received provisions from Venice. The Turkish attacks had made no headway, and the Ottoman army had lost many troops during the siege, whereas Skanderbeg's force had lost around 1,000 men. Moisi Galemi and Tanishthopia raised a couple thousand more soldiers, and the force was split between the three, making attacks on the Turkish camp much easier. Skanderbeg began to move towards the camp, as the Turks had assembled 8,000 men, which began to move towards him. Skanderbeg slowly retired while Moisi and Tanish broke into the camp. The Turkish force sent against Skanderbeg was lured towards the foothills, and the next morning, they were surrounded and completely destroyed. This vicious cycle of failed assaults and surprise Albanian ambushes resulted on heavy Ottoman casualties, as the Turkish army made little progress in capturing Kruja. As summer turned into fall, on October 26, the Ottoman Sultan lifted the siege of Kruja and headed back to Edirne. The 6-month-long campaign had failed disastrously. The Ottoman casualties amounted to almost half the army. Although Skanderbeg had achieved success in resisting Murad II himself, harvests were unproductive and famine was widespread. Additionally, with an internal conflict, a destroyed economy, and a weakened army, Skanderbeg realized that he needed to make an alliance with a powerful state so that the League would continue its existence. He first approached the Republic of Venice, offering a military alliance and a sort of vassalhood to the Republic of Venice. The Republic refused Skanderbeg's offer, as they were enjoying the good relations and their trade with the Ottoman Empire. Rome offered some financial help, but Skanderbeg was looking for more. He then turned to King Alfonso of Aragon, who controlled Naples and Sicily. Alfonso aimed on expanding his empire, from Gibraltar to the Bosphorus. In order to realize his dreams of a great Aragonese empire, he would need a bridgehead in the Balkans, from where he could march to Constantinople. Alfonso thus took up the offer to establish diplomatic relations with Skanderbeg and his Albanian allies. And in 1451, Skanderbeg became a vassal of Aragon, in exchange for urgent military aid against the Ottomans. In addition to foreign aid, Skanderbeg married the daughter of Gjergj Arianiti, concluding in the House of Arianiti rejoining the Albanian League. Alfonso wanted to see the League become powerful enough to seriously challenge the Ottoman Empire, much unlike the Venetians, who were troubled by the growing Albanian state. In May, Alfonso sent 2 experienced Catalan officers with 200 men and plenty of supplies to Kruja. Sultan Mehmed had been planning a campaign against Albania ever since Skanderbeg had defeated his father at Kruja. Another factor was that Kruja geographically dominated Durazzo, which was only 150 kilometers from Brindisi, the nearest Italian port. Mehmed's ambitions were symmetrical to Alfonso's, and it was clear that there would be a clash between the two in Albania, the epicenter of the conflict. While Mehmed was focused on defeating the Karamanids in the east, Skanderbeg took up the rebuilding of Kruja and built a new fortress in Modric near Svetigrad. All of these political and military developments couldn't have come any sooner, as an Ottoman provincial army of 25,000, led by Tahit Pasha and Hamza Bey, invaded Albania by 1452. Skanderbeg gathered 14,000 men and marched against Tahit Pasha's army. He planned to first defeat Hamza, and then to move around Tahit Pasha and encircle him. Hamza had 12,000 men under his personal command, and was camped near the new fortress of Modric. Skanderbeg did not give Hamza much time to prepare, and on 21 July, he assaulted immediately. Skanderbeg managed to ambush and rout the Ottoman force, where Hamza Pasha was captured. In the following days, the Albanian lord continued on his victory with another against Tahit Pasha's isolated 18,000 men. During the heat of battle, Tahit Pasha himself was killed and the Ottomans began to flee in disarray. Between the two engagements, over 7,000 Ottomans were killed, and many more were wounded. The Albanians had suffered 1,000 casualties, and in their exhaustion, they refused to pursue the fleeing Ottoman forces. Skanderbeg's victory over a ruler even more powerful than Murad came as a great surprise to the Albanians, in particular to Lek Dukagini, as he now opted for a reconciliation. On the 22nd of April of 1453, Mehmed sent another army to Albania, under the command of Ibrahim Pasha. However, Skanderbeg's army was able to defeat and rout the local Turkish host, which in the heat of battle, Ibrahim Pasha was killed by Skanderbeg, on a fiercely duel. The Albanian victory, however, was shadowed by Mehmed's conquest of Constantinople, only 5 weeks after, which deeply troubled the Christian states of Europe. Mehmed, by then called the Conqueror, turned his attention to finally defeating the Kingdom of Hungary, and crossing into Italy. Upon conquering Constantinople after a prolonged siege, Sultan Mehmed II had established his realm as one of the foremost powers of its age. With the final fall of the Eastern Roman Empire, Mehmed II set its eyes on the Balkans, in particular to the Serbian despot, Đurađ Branković. Although the Serbian despot had stayed neutral in the military campaigns of 1453, its status as an impartial buffer state was questioned when Hungarian emissaries threatened war against the Ottoman Sultan. By the summer of 1454, Mehmed invaded Serbia. During the background of all these military developments, Skanderbeg and the Venetians informed King Alfonso and the Pope about a possible Ottoman invasion and asked for urgent aid. The Pope sent 3,000 ducats, while Alfonso sent 500 infantry and a certain amount of money to Skanderbeg. Meanwhile, the Venetian Senate was resenting Skanderbeg's alliance with Naples, an old enemy of Venice. Frequently they delayed their tributes to Skanderbeg, and this was a long matter of dispute between the parties, with Skanderbeg threatening war on Venice at least 3 times between 1448 and 1458. The Neapolitan soldiers were highly skilled in demolition, artillery, and siege tactics. Their introduction of artillery cannon signaled a significant shift, demonstrating Skanderbeg's newfound ability to mount serious offensive operations against the Ottomans. After making peace with the hostile northern House of Gjergj, Skanderbeg turned his attention to recapturing the fortress of Berat, a stronghold that had fallen to an unexpected Ottoman attack in 1450. Mustering his regular force of 14,000, the Lord of Albania advanced on the fortress in 1455 and laid siege. Skanderbeg besieged the Ottoman-occupied castle, and with the aid of Neapolitan artillery, they bombarded the stronghold relentlessly. The Ottoman commander, pressed by the assault, offered to surrender the city if no reinforcements arrived within a month. Convinced the victory was all but certain, Skanderbeg entrusted the siege to his commanders and departed with a large contingent of troops towards Vlora. At the head of the remaining force, he left Karl his brother-in-law, since Berat was formerly a possession of Muzaka's family, and about 5,000 cavalry on the banks of the Osum River, in order to finalize the surrender. After a successful bombardment, the Ottoman commander of the garrison agreed to turn over the keys of the castle if the Sultan had not sent reinforcements within a certain amount of time. This was a ploy to fool the Albanian forces into a false sense of security and delay any actions, giving Ottoman reinforcements time to arrive. In a costly error, the Sultan sent an army of 20,000 troops, led by Isa Bey Evrenos. The reinforcement surprised the Albanian army in mid-July of 1455. The Ottomans caught the Albanian cavalry by surprise while they were resting on the banks of the Osum River. And almost all the 5,000 Albanian cavalry laying siege to Berat were killed. Most of the forces belonged to Gjergj Arianiti, whose role as Skanderbeg's ally greatly diminished after the defeat. The attitude of other Albanian nobility was also somewhat affected. Only one Albanian commander, Vrana Conti, managed to resist the initial Ottoman onslaught and pushed back several attacking waves. His efforts, however, were not able to change the course of the battle, and the Albanian army degenerated into a total rout. Around 6,000 Albanians died, including the 800-men contingent of Neapolitans from Alfonso's, as experts in demolition, artillery, and siege warfare. Their cannons, once thundering defiance, now stood silent above the lifeless forms of those who had served them. The commander of the siege, Karl had also died during the battle. His death was more than the loss of a commander, it was the extinguishing of a bloodline's claim to the very land on which he perished. Skanderbeg himself was not at the battle, having moved southwest to inspect the routes to Vlora and hinder a potential surprise attack from the garrison there. Upon hearing the news, he rushed back to the city, but by the time of his arrival, the battle was already over. Italian chronicles of the time described Skanderbeg as performing feats of bravery with sword and mace, and that many owed their life to his opportune intervention. The results at Berat were disastrous and badly crippled the Albanian resistance for a time. Berat remained in the hands of the Ottomans, and was never to be taken again by the Albanian League. The major Albanian defeat at the siege of Berat was to be a massive blow to the Albanian revolt, as Moisi Arianit Galemi, one of Skanderbeg's most trusted and capable commanders, defected to the Ottomans. Mehmed II had promised him a large pension and a high-ranking post in the Ottoman administration. Because of the knowledge Moisi possessed of Skanderbeg's strategies and of the Albanian terrain, Skanderbeg made all his dispositions for defense. While the Ottoman Sultan marched on Belgrade in 1456, Moisi marched on Albania, at the head of a 15,000-strong Ottoman host. Since Moisi was a master in sleights and subtleties, Skanderbeg led the invader march through Oranik without any interruptions. Even when Moisi arrived, Skanderbeg was ready to deal with him by sending envoys. But Moisi did not stop his march. The two armies met at the plain field of Oranik, and the battle began with man-to-man combat between one soldier from each army. an Ottoman named Ahimaz stepped out and issued a challenge, which was taken up by an Albanian, Zoharia Gropa. The fight continued on foot, until Zoharia stabbed Ahimaz in the throat, and cut off his head. Moisi Galemi then stepped out and challenged Skanderbeg to personal combat. As Skanderbeg began to move towards him, Moisi Galemi turned around and fled back to his own army, giving orders to begin the attack on the Albanians. The Ottoman forces were in two lines, the second consisting of militias, who were to support the first line in case of inconvenience. Behind these two lines stood Moisi Galemi with his reserves. Skanderbeg's force, comprising of 6,000 men on horse and 4,000 on foot, were divided into three lines, with the Albanian lord in charge of the center. Both Ottoman lines quickly broke under the shock of the Albanian cavalry attack, and the battle turned to hand-to-hand fighting, with both commanders dangerously involved. During the heat of battle, Moisi Galemi was wounded, and was pulled away from the battlefield by his personal bodyguards. Unable to break through the Albanian center, the Ottomans began their retreat. However, many were killed during the hectic retreat, as the Albanian horsemen trapped many lost Ottomans. Moisi, wounded in the chaos of battle and having seen as many as 10,000 of his men cut down, fled in despair back to Skopje. His treason had ended in ruin, his reputation in ashes, and his name stained as a traitor. Despite his treason and great defeat, Skanderbeg would pardon the disgraced Albanian lord, and would restore his titles and lands to him. Bonfires were lit to celebrate his return, and the people were sternly warned never to speak aloud of his offense, as the very memory of treachery was to be buried for the sake of the unity. Although Moisi had been defeated, further defections from the Albanian League occurred in the following months, as the Albanian nobility began to waver in their support for the increasingly despotic Skanderbeg, whom they now viewed as a more significant threat to their estates than the Ottomans. In 1456, another defection came from one of Skanderbeg's nephews, Gjergj Balshaw, as he sold the fortress of Modric to the Ottomans for 30,000 silver ducats. He falsely portrayed it as an enemy capture to Skanderbeg. However, when exposed, he was imprisoned and sent to Naples. In 1457, a far more serious and shocking defection came by House of Kastrioti, Skanderbeg's nephew, who had been on his side since the start of the rebellion. It is believed that Hamza felt threatened by the birth of Skanderbeg's son the previous year, and lost every hope of inheriting the Principality of Kastrioti. In return for his defection, Mehmed II had promised to make Hamza the governor of all Albania, and the domains of the Kastrioti family, if he helped his armies defeat Skanderbeg. His loss was regarded as a tragedy by Albanians, as he was one of the most brilliant commanders of Skanderbeg, and was very popular among the soldiers for his manners. Because Hamza knew both the treacherous terrain of Albania, and the very tactics Skanderbeg uses on his battles, the Albanian lord was forced to alter his tactics. The mountains and valleys, that had so often been his shield and weapon, could now betray him. Every march, every ambush, every feigned retreat had to be reconsidered, as Hamza carried in his mind the secrets of Skanderbeg's art of warfare. In July of 1456, Mehmed II marched a large army to besiege the Hungarian-held fortress of Belgrade, but was defeated by the Hungarian regent. Skanderbeg's resources were worn out after over a decade of continuous war. Alfonso and the Pope could not provide for him externally, while Venice continued to undermine Skanderbeg. The latter even considered war with Skanderbeg, since he maintained his alliance with Aragon. Relations with the Italian state worsened even further when Lech Ducagini, Skanderbeg's elusive ally in the north, captured the fortress of Dagnum. Even though Skanderbeg did not participate in this, Venice used it as a casus belli to launch an expedition against Skanderbeg. The war never started officially, but the Albanian-Venetian relations sunk to their lowest point. The Venetian rectors continued to provoke Skanderbeg at a time when he had grown relatively weak, due to his nephew and one of his most important commanders, Hamza Kastrioti, deserting and joining the Ottomans. Stung by the betrayal, Skanderbeg offered an ultimatum to Venice, where they had to halt their provocations or he would raid the northern Albanian Veneta. Since a crusade was anticipated against the Ottomans, Venice did not want to seem pro-Ottoman, and eased their stance towards Albania. By the end of May 1457, a large Ottoman army was seen approaching Albania. Mehmed II had placed Ishak Bey Evrenos and Hamza Kastrioti in command of the force. Ishak Bey was an experienced commander who led the Ottoman counterattack at the siege of Berat. Hamza brought along with him several disaffected Albanian nobles and personal knowledge of the tactics they could expect from Skanderbeg. In total, the Ottoman forces numbered between 50 and 80,000 men. Armies of this size were usually commanded by the Sultan himself, so rumors spread that Mehmed was leading the campaign. In contrast, Skanderbeg had around 10,000 men. The Ottoman army did not march into Albania in one group. The first detachments to arrive were the Akinkai raiders, who marched through Dibra. Skanderbeg stalled this force's advance, but once the main force arrived, the Albanians were not able to offer further resistance and withdrew. Realizing that both Ottoman commanders, Ishak Bey and Hamza, were familiar with the Albanian terrain and his tactics, Skanderbeg decided to adopt a new means of engagement. Normally, he would lure his enemy into a trap and then ambush them. His new tactic was very similar to his normal, however, he chose to approach it in a different manner. To make it impossible to be followed, Skanderbeg split his forces into several groups and ordered their respective commanders to march through the forests and mountains in different directions and to never assemble or assault the Ottomans unless instructed to do so. The Ottomans marched through Mat and pillaged the area. Since he had not yet engaged Skanderbeg, Ishak Bey decided not to besiege Kruja yet, until he was sure of Skanderbeg's whereabouts. He thus camped with his men in the area north of Mount Tumanishta to wait for Skanderbeg's appearance. This region was called Albulena, located south of modern-day Lok. It was surrounded by a series of protective hills, where guards were placed. Since Tumanishta had served as the main base for Skanderbeg at the siege of Kruja, Ishak Bey and Hamza prepared to annihilate any resistance they would find there. This effort came in vain, however, as they were not challenged by any Albanian forces. Still unsure of Skanderbeg's dispositions, the Ottoman commanders strengthened the camp's northern defenses, while the eastern side, in the direction of Tumanishta, remained lightly defended. Due to Skanderbeg's disappearance, rumors began to spread that he had fled, since he was unable to confront the Ottomans, and that his men had betrayed him. Ishak Bey and Hamza continued to be wary, and their reconnaissance forces reached as far north as Scutari. Skanderbeg remained in the mountains throughout July and August. It is not known with certainty what his army did while in the mountains, but he planned to wear the Ottomans out by forcing them to wait and to make them believe that he had been decisively defeated. The local population remained faithful to Skanderbeg and did not reveal his whereabouts. Ishak Bey and Hamza grew confident that Skanderbeg had been defeated. The Albanian force was split into 3 groups to assault the Ottoman camp. With some of his most trusted men, he climbed to a high peak to scout on the Ottoman camp and saw that the Ottomans were resting. He descended with his chosen companions to eliminate any watching guards. But one saw Skanderbeg and fled into the camp, yelling that Skanderbeg had arrived. In order to maintain the surprise, Skanderbeg ordered his men to get ready for battle. With the accompaniment of loud noise, made from metallic tools, and weapons being clapped together, the Albanians charged into the Turkish camp. The Ottomans were caught by surprise, and despite their large numbers, were terrified by the fury of the Albanian assault, thinking they were attacking in larger numbers than they actually had. Hamza tried to reorder his men, assuring them that the Albanians were few. Ishak Bey tried to send reinforcements to Hamza's men, but the arrival of a new Albanian contingent forced him to turn his attention. The Ottomans were split into 2, as a series of cavalry charges and countercharges kept the battle moving, with a rain of missiles and arquebusiers, forcing the Ottomans, withdrawing into the heart of the camp. Another Albanian war horn was heard, and the 3rd Albanian troops in hiding also appeared and began charging towards the Ottomans. Seeing that they were surrounded, the Ottoman force began to panic and melted away. The Ottoman casualties may have been as high as 15,000. In addition, another 15,000 men were taken prisoner, 24 standards were captured, and all the riches in the camp were lost to the Albanians. A multitude of men were also captured, among them House of Kastrioti. The Battle of Albulena was significant for the southern resistance against the Ottoman Empire. The battle had also strengthened the morale of Skanderbeg's men, who afterwards, rarely, if at all, deserted his army as Hamza had. Hamza himself was sent to Naples in Alfonso's realm. An Ottoman envoy was sent to settle for a truce between Mehmed and Skanderbeg. The latter responded that he would only accept if Svetigrad and Berat, which had been lost in 1448 and 1450, were restored to his state. Seeing that Mehmed would not accept such terms, Skanderbeg strengthened his garrisons in the area around Svetigrad. This gave Skanderbeg the opportunity to land in Italy and help out Alfonso's son, Ferdinand of Naples, who had been crowned after his father had died. In 1457, Skanderbeg had achieved his most famous victory over the Ottoman Empire at the Battle of Albulena, which was received with great enthusiasm throughout Italy. King Ferdinand of Naples was dealing with another Angevin uprising and asked for help from Skanderbeg. In order to repay Alfonso for the financial and military assistance given to him years before, Skanderbeg took up the Pope's pleas to help out Alfonso's son by sending a military expedition to Italy. However, before leaving, Skanderbeg tried to negotiate a ceasefire with the Ottoman Sultan to ensure his domain's safety. And in 1459, after Ottomans completed their conquest of Serbia, Ottoman envoys appealed for a 3-year armistice between Albania and the Ottoman Empire. The Sultan's purpose was to distance Skanderbeg from the Pope's crusade, as he believed the Crusade's only hope for success was Skanderbeg. In order to give Albania a break from 15 years of continuous Ottoman invasion, Skanderbeg considered accepting the proposal, but he had to get the Pope's approval. Pius did not allow such an agreement and began to doubt Skanderbeg's loyalty. He thus sent ambassadors to the Pope, saying that he would only be willing to land in Italy if a ceasefire with the Turks were arranged, something which the Pope would soon allow. A 3-year truce was declared after Ottomans conquered Serbia, giving Skanderbeg the opportunity to land in Italy. Skanderbeg first sent his nephew, Constantine, with a contingent of around 500 light cavalry. Upon arriving at the town of Barletta, they were immediately detached into Ferdinand's forces to combat his Angevin rivals. By this time, Ferdinand had lost most of his territory, and was left with some fortresses in Apulia and the area surrounding Naples. The Albanians were encouraged by Ferdinand to fight in their traditional manners, and to raid the territory. Ferdinand then informed Francisco Sforza that the Albanians had been devastating Apulia, and taking whatever loot they could. These events worried the Angevins and prompted Giovanni Orsini to try to stop Skanderbeg from pouring his men into Italy. René d'Anjou had been particularly surprised by Skanderbeg's actions, since he believed that he had never offended the Albanians. Additionally, Ferdinand's main rival, Giovanni Antonio Orsini, tried to dissuade Skanderbeg from this war, and even offered him an alliance. This, however, did not affect Skanderbeg, who would then send a letter to the Prince of Taranto, stating that, "Moreover, you scorn our people, claiming the Albanians as nothing more than sheep, and according to your customs, think of us with only insults. It would seem you know nothing of the origins of our race. Our elders were the Epirotes, from whence Pyrrhus himself came forth, the might of whom the Romans could barely withstand. From those men descend these who you call sheep, but the nature of things is not changed. Why do your men run away in the faces of sheep?" The fighting continued for 3 months, after which Constantine and Ferdinand were able to regain some lost territory. Piccinino, along with Giovanni Orsini's men, retaliated by laying siege to the main castles. While Ferdinand abandoned the city and fled back to Apulia, he met Skanderbeg's ambassador, Gjergj Stres-Balshaw, who informed him that Skanderbeg was ready to land in Italy as soon as the proper galleys were provided. Before leaving for Italy, Skanderbeg needed to accumulate the appropriate equipment. Due to issues of finance and the lack of large ships, Skanderbeg's arrival was delayed, while Ferdinand was under siege in Barletta. After several papal and Neapolitan ships had arrived near Durazzo, Skanderbeg sent one of his commanders, Ivan Stres-Balshaw, with a contingent of around 500 cavalry and 1,000 infantry to the besieged Ferdinand, whereas Skanderbeg himself went to Ragusa to convince its rectors there to give him his needed funds. Ivan's men landed in Barletta on the 24th of August, 1461. The Angevin forces, among whom was Giovanni Orsini, had besieged the castle of Barletta with around 7,000 men. For 12 days, the Angevins rained hell upon Barletta, as the new standardized Angevin artillery's target was to bombard the wall's battlements and breach the city's walls. However, the walls of the city held on under heavy Angevin cannon fire. Giovanni Orsini then ordered his main infantry to assault the walls, as a long and bitter battle for possession of the walls followed. However, the determined defenders of the city proved steadfast in their battlements as they repulsed wave after wave of the Angevin attacks on the walls. Shortly after, the Albanian banners of the League of Lesher were visibly from far off the distance. Believing that Skanderbeg himself was the leader of this force, the Angevins lifted the siege of Barletta and began withdrawing into friendly territory. Ivan then informed Ferdinand that Skanderbeg would arrive after his voyage to Ragusa. Ferdinand felt that Skanderbeg's personal involvement was essential for the war's success. Skanderbeg reached Ragusa on the 24th of August, and due to papal pressure, the Ragusans had reconsidered Skanderbeg's requests and granted the financial sum. His men were also supplied with food for their upcoming campaign. Upon landing in Italy, Ferdinand put him in command of the fortress of Barletta, whereas the king himself went to Ariano Irpino. Once left in command of the fortress, Skanderbeg moved against Ferdinand's rivals. Among them were Giovanni Orsini, John d'Anjou, Piccinino, and Francesco del Balzo. They had stationed themselves in Andria, where the Albanian assaults continued. The Albanian cavalry's light armament, swift horses, and loose ranks allowed them to quickly overcome the heavily armed Italian cavalry, which fought in tight formations. Skanderbeg then marched to Taranto. Again Orsini tried to dissuade Skanderbeg from marching against him, but Ferdinand was wary of Orsini's faithfulness, so Skanderbeg continued raiding Orsini's territory. Skanderbeg's next task was to recapture Trani, the second most important point in Apulia. Skanderbeg succeeded in capturing the commander of the garrison, Fusha de Foxa, who had rebelled against Ferdinand the year prior. On the morning of the 28th of December, 1461, with Fusha's pleas, Graciani, the vice-commander of the garrison, surrendered Trani to Skanderbeg. After weeks of marauding, Skanderbeg and his Aragonese allies joined Alessandro Sforza. Together, they captured all of the remaining fortresses in southern Sicily. Seeing that their fortunes were dwindling, Skanderbeg stayed in Apulia for another month until January 1462, and then returned to Albania. However, most of his troops remained in Italy, under Ivan Balshar. His reason for leaving Italy is not clear, but it is believed that at that time, Mehmed was preparing his campaign against Hungary, something which could be turned against Albania. The war over the crown of Naples continued for several more months after Skanderbeg left. In late July of 1462, the Aragonese army captured the small fortress town of Acadia, after a 19-day siege. Acadia fell on the 9th of August of 1462, denying the rebels an important outpost, and boosting the morale of Ferdinand's troops. John of Anjou's field army, led by Condottiero Jacopo Piccinino, attempted to relieve Acadia from the besiegers, but had failed, as they withdrew towards Troia. Ferdinand, flushed with his recent success, pursued the John of Anjou's host. Just over a week later, on the 18th of August, 1462, the two forces converged in northern Apulia, near the town of Troia. Forming up for the ensuing battle, John had deployed his 3,000 Angevin infantry on the center of the field. Meanwhile, the Italian heavily armored cavalry formed the right wing, while the Angevin cavalry deployed on the left wing. From their Advantaga slope, the Aragonese army also formed up for battle. Alessandro Sforza commanded the center with the main corps of his infantry, and the contingent from Skanderbeg's veterans, numbering up to 3,000 in total. The Albanian light cavalry mainly made up the left wing, supported by Roberto Orsini's Italian cavalry. And in the right wing, Roberto Sanseverino commanded his personal retinue of cavalry. The fight began in the morning, and lasted for about 6 hours. Ferdinand likely sought to smash the Angevin center, or trigger a collapse of their flanks by weight of cavalry. The battle began with a general charge of both Aragonese wings into the ranks of the Angevins. After some bloody fighting, the Angevins began losing ground, and were slowly pushed back to their camps. Seeing the tides turn in his favor, Sforza launched his main assault on the Angevin center with the bulk of his core troops. The Angevin infantry could not withstand repeated attacks from Ferdinand's armored men-at-arms, as the Aragonese cavalry had gained the upper hand on the Angevin flanks. After intense fighting, the royalist Aragonese army gained a clear upper hand, and the Angevin Italian forces began to give way and retreat in mass. Many of the Angevins started to retreat in disorder towards the walled town of Troia, as this collapse effectively ended the battle. The Battle of Troia decisively turned the tide of the conspiracy of the barons. The Prince of Taranto made peace with Ferdinand, and was followed by other barons. The victory cemented Ferdinand's rule and demonstrated the strength of the emerging Aragonese administration in Naples. For Skanderbeg's services, Ferdinand awarded Monte Sant'Angelo, where many of his men soon settled in, and would eventually form the Arbresh community, which is still present today. Upon returning to Albania after securing Ferdinand's throne, the Venetians became hostile to Skanderbeg, and a sort of undeclared war took place. Mehmed II's successes in the east prompted him to launch a new campaign against Skanderbeg. He prepared by sending 3 separate armies into Albania. The first detachment to arrive was Hassan Pasha's force, containing of around 23,000 troops. Upon learning of the Sultan's plans, he immediately marched into Macedonia with an army of around 8,000. Knowing this, Skanderbeg figured out what route Hassan would take, so he chose to encamp in a mountain overlooking the path near Mokra. Skanderbeg anticipated the Ottoman invasion and positioned his Albanian forces on a mountain in the Mokra Valley, where the Ottoman cavalry was expected to pass. Unaware that Skanderbeg was ready to meet him, the Ottomans were slowly marching through the valley. As the valley was narrow, only a quarter of the Ottomans were targeted, specifically the Turkish vanguard. As the large Ottoman force under Hassan Bey entered the valley, Skanderbeg ordered his men to charge directly into the Ottomans, beating their drums and clashing their swords to create the impression of a much larger army than it actually was. The deception worked, and the Ottoman troops, facing what they believed to be a significantly larger enemy, lost their nerve and retreated in disarray. The Albanian forces then pursued the retreating Ottomans, inflicting heavy casualties and taking many prisoners along the way. On the aftermath of the battle, most of the Ottoman soldiers were killed, and Hassan himself was wounded by an arrow, piercing through his right arm. This victory showcased Skanderbeg's mastery of guerrilla warfare, and his ability to use the mountainous terrain to his advantage, forcing the enemy to disperse their troops and become vulnerable to the Albanian hit-and-run tactics. After Hassan's army had been destroyed, Yusuf Pasha, another Ottoman commander, went to defeat Skanderbeg and avenge his colleague. With the Sultan's permission, he marched out with 18,000 troops to Skopje. From there, he marched into Palog, near Tetovo. Yusuf's fate was similar to Hassan's. Skanderbeg attacked and annihilated Yusuf's force, but the Pasha fled, leaving his army behind to be reduced. Karaza Pasha, another of the Sultan's commanders, was lured into Albania for hope of attaining glory, despite his old age. The Sultan yielded 30,000 cavalry to Karaza, who soon marched to Albania. Unlike his 2 compatriots before him, Karaza chose to march through Lower Dibra, and not Upper Dibra, passing by Ohrid. In the meantime, a scouting force of 4,000 was drawn out ahead of the main army to gather information on the Albanian positions. But the majority of this force was destroyed during an ambush. The Pasha, upon hearing of the disaster, threw a fit of anger, less due to his troops being killed than his plans being foiled. Karaza then devised a strategy by which to trick Skanderbeg. He sent several envoys to Skanderbeg, condemning his cowardice, and calling on him to fight on the open field, instead of hiding in the forests. As the Albanian lord did not respond to the envoys, Karaza then began to consolidate with the native people. Skanderbeg, always being well informed, immediately ordered an attack on the Ottoman camp. The attack was so fierce that few knew what was happening, and chaos soon ensued. However, Skanderbeg was not able to achieve his goal of annihilation. but he was still able to do much damage to the Ottoman forces. Kruja immediately escaped with much of his army and traveled back to Constantinople, where he was pardoned by the Sultan for succeeding in preventing the annihilation of his force, which the previous commanders fell victim to. During the 3 battles, up to 20,000 Turks were killed, captured, or wounded. This was the first time that Skanderbeg would win 3 battles in 1 month. In the summer 1463, a huge army under the Sultan's personal command gathered near Skopje. Fearing that the Ottoman Sultan was about to launch a new campaign into Albania, Thopia made urgent requests to establish peace with the Ottomans. Skanderbeg did not want peace, but Thopia's willingness for peace had prevailed and convinced the Albanian lord. The Peace of Skopje was concluded on April 27, 1463, largely out of fear of a resurgent Albanian campaign like the year before. Skanderbeg did not intend to maintain the peace, however, and told the Pope that he would march against the Ottomans whenever the latter ordered him to. Meanwhile, the position of Venice towards Skanderbeg had changed perceptibly because the Venetians entered a war with the Ottomans. The Venetians grew worried after Skanderbeg's peace with the Ottomans and soon set out trying to reconcile with Skanderbeg. On August 20, 1463, an alliance against the Ottoman Empire was concluded between the two. The terms of the alliance were that Venetian contingents and subsidies were to be given to Skanderbeg to help in his future wars against the Ottomans. Venetian ships and auxiliary ships were to be present in Albanian waters to protect the population. If Venice concluded peace with Ottoman Empire, Albania was to be included. Skanderbeg would be given refuge in Venetian territory in case he was driven out of Albania, and his pension arrears would be paid by Venice and not by its proveditors. In November of 1463, Pope Pius II tried to organize a new crusade against the Ottomans, similar to what Pope Nicholas V and Pope Calixtus III tried before. Pius II invited all Christian nobility to join, and the Venetians immediately answered the appeal. In addition to the Venetians, Matthias of Hungary had also joined the crusade, alongside Philip III of Burgundy. With high hopes, a new crusader host was planned to be mustered at the port town of Ancona, where it would sail off to the aid of Albania in the following year. With the prospect of receiving actual support for the first time in his struggle against the Ottomans, Skanderbeg responded to the papal summons for a crusade by breaking the truce and declaring a holy war on the Ottomans. Pius II planned crusade envisioned assembling 20,000 troops in Taranto, while another 20,000 would be gathered by Skanderbeg. However, Pius died in August of 1464, at the crucial moment when the crusading armies were gathering and preparing to march in Ancona. With Burgundy backing out of the crusade at the last moment, and Hungary uninterested in going into a full-on war so soon after its struggle against Austria, Venice and Albania were again left virtually alone to fight the Ottomans. Wanting to go on the offensive before the Sultan could retaliate for breaking the truce, Skanderbeg mustered an army of 12,000 Albanians and 1,000 Venetians, with which he invaded the Ottoman Macedonia. The Albanian lord approached the Ottoman stronghold in the area, the city of Ohrid, which was defended by 15,000 under Sheremet Pasha. Skanderbeg did not have enough troops to assault the fortifications, so he sent a small 500 cavalry detachment, where they were to approach the gates of Ohrid and provoke the Ottomans to attack. They were to throw smoke and dust into the air to irritate the garrison, then they were to feign retreat, where the pursuing Ottoman cavalry would be ambushed by the main Albanian force. This plan worked perfectly. The Ottoman force rode right into the Albanian ambush and were slaughtered. Around 10,000 Ottomans were killed, and 12 Ottoman units were captured, among them Sheremet's son. Skanderbeg then besieged Ohrid for a short time before returning to Albania. The Venetian Senate hailed the campaign as a victory, despite not being able to take Ohrid. The crusade seemed to have gone well for the Christian side, but after Pius' death, the remaining cardinals lost their hope and decided to put the papal galleys in the hands of the Doge of Venice. They also sent the 48,000 gold ducats, which Pius had on hand for the crusade, to Matthias of Hungary. The following spring, another Ottoman provincial army, under the command of Ballaban Bada, planned to invade Albania with a force of over 18,000 Akinji raiders. Ballaban had been born in Skanderbeg's ancestral domains, and was raised through the Divserm system to become a janissary for the Sultan, much like Skanderbeg. Ballaban had known Skanderbeg when they were both in the Ottoman court, but he had always held great animosity towards him. Once he had learned that Skanderbeg had been camped in Vakil with his men, Ballaban began his campaign against the Albanian lord. Skanderbeg had been expecting an Ottoman assault, and ensured that his troops were constantly prepared. The day before the engagement, he formulated his plan of action. He aimed to trick the Ottomans into thinking that his forces were too weak, and too frightened to fight. When the Ottomans were finally lured into the valley, under a false sense of security, the Albanian warriors would attack them. The Ottoman forces would then be pursued all the way up to the hills, and the Albanians would stop there, to avoid any counterattack by the Turks. The next day, Ballaban came past the hills, but unexpectedly charged at Skanderbeg's forces. Skanderbeg allowed them to approach, before launching his own counterattack. A bloody battle followed, resulting in heavy casualties for both sides. Nonetheless, Skanderbeg and the Albanians held their ground, and were victorious as the Ottomans soon began to flee. Skanderbeg's plan had worked well, and most of Skanderbeg's forces had halted after pursuing the Ottomans up to the hills. However, some of the Albanian officers failed to follow Skanderbeg's orders, and continued to doggedly pursue the fleeing Ottomans, but were now unsupported by their infantry. They had charged too far. Ballaban turned and expertly managed to rally his fleeing army, speeding across the line on his horse to motivate his soldiers, and leading an attack on the isolated Albanian contingents, which attempted to retreat. In the ensuing conflict, many veteran Albanians were killed or captured. After being ambushed by the fleeing Ottomans, the Albanian officers fled to the top of a hill, where they encountered Ottoman infantrymen. The Albanians had wrongfully believed the infantrymen to be Christians, and were subsequently captured and sent to Ballaban. After the Ottomans regrouped, with their newly acquired captives, Ballaban ordered his men to march back to Constantinople with the prisoners. Among them were distinguished leaders such as Moise Galemi, Vladan Juria, Musek Arianiti, Jin Muzaka, John Palati, Nicole Berisha, George Kuka, and Jin Maneshi. Skanderbeg sent an ambassador to the Sultan begging him to return his officers unharmed, or else he would execute his own prisoners of war. The Sultan was not moved, and refused to free them after being informed of their importance by Ballaban. The Sultan ordered a 15-day torture, and the execution of the Albanian officers in which they were skinned alive, one by one. On the aftermath of the Battle of Vakil, the 20 Albanian noblemen that were captured were paraded back to Constantinople. Even though Skanderbeg tried to ransom them, the Ottoman Sultan refused, after being informed of their importance by Ballaban. The Albanian nobles were then executed, and their corpses were thrown to the dogs of the capital. Moise was described as one of the best commanders of the Albanian League, known for his military abilities, including capturing Ottoman holdings in the Diba region, leading troops in many battles, and overseeing the capture of Svetigrad back in 1444. Upon hearing of their brutal execution, Skanderbeg swore a solemn vow before his captains, stating that he would not rest until the traitor drinks the dust of his homeland, and paid for their actions. The vow was not directed only at the Turks, but also at Ballaban, whom he considered a traitor for turning against his own people. On the contrast, Mehmed ordered Ballaban to continue his campaigns against Albania. In the summer of 1465, two more Ottoman provincial armies invaded Albania, in a two-pronged assault. Led again by Ballaban Bada and Jakub Pasha. In the first battle of the campaign at Mehmed, the Albanian lord managed to defeat the Ottomans, and inflict some casualties. A few days later at Kashari, Skanderbeg would again ambush another Ottoman army, and capture and kill its commander Jakub Pasha. In retaliation for the torture and execution of the Albanian nobles in the previous year, Skanderbeg ordered all Ottoman captives taken on the campaign to be executed. This resulted in over 15,000 casualties for the Ottomans, in only 3 months. In the meantime, Mehmed continued to negotiate peace with Hungary and Venice. Skanderbeg found himself isolated during these negotiations. Furthermore, Ferdinand of Naples did not send his promised forces. During the autumn of 1465, Ottoman forces moved from Bosnia in order to speed up the peace negotiations. Venice, however, refused peace, and Skanderbeg believed that a new Albanian-Venetian campaign would soon begin. He kept Pal Angel, his ambassador, in constant correspondence with the Venetian Senate, which then sent him back to Albania to inform Skanderbeg that troops were being raised. Venice was also in the process of sending its proveditors in Albanian Veneta, around 3,000 ducats, in order to recruit soldiers for future campaigns. They would also send for cannons, 10 springles, and 10 barrels of gunpowder. Throughout April, rumors spread that the Ottomans were planning to march into Albania. And by the 18th of April, 1466, Venice received confirmation that the Ottomans were heading towards Albania. After many years of hearing news about defeats in the region, Mehmed began preparing to march against Skanderbeg in 1466. The target of the campaign was the Albanian capital of Kruja, the mountain fortress that Murad II had unsuccessfully besieged 15 years earlier. Leaving his capital at the head of a 30,000-strong host, the Sultan arrived in Albania during the summer of 1466. Skanderbeg's situation was dire, as none of the promised reinforcements from Naples and Venice arrived. Soon after, Mehmed's men marched into Albania. Unlike his father Murad II, Mehmed considered that the only way Albania could be conquered would be through isolating Kruja by reducing Skanderbeg's manpower, supplies, political, and moral backing. Once more, Ottoman raiders burned and pillaged the countryside, and would engage in massacring the local population and burning every village which offered resistance. Skanderbeg did not expect such a campaign, and his army was far from being ready to halt the Turkish advance. Skanderbeg then sent 12 ships, with many inhabitants of Kruja, to Italy. Among them was his wife, Donica, and his son, John. They were headed to Monte Sant'Angelo, a castle awarded to Skanderbeg after his campaigns to restore Ferdinand's rule. The arrival of Albanian refugees further distressed the Pope and many Italians who had come to believe that Albania had been conquered, and that Mehmed was now preparing to march into Italy. Skanderbeg retreated to the mountains surrounding Shkodër with the bulk of his men, while leaving Tanush in charge of the fortress. Mehmed's Akinjis were allowed to raid the country, a decision which was an act of reprisal, regarding Skanderbeg's raids in Macedonia back in 1464, which interrupted Mehmed's siege on Yaritse. Skanderbeg had placed 4,000 men under Tanush Thopia's command. This force included 1,000 Venetians under Baldassare Paducci, and 200 Neapolitan marksmen. Mehmed had marched into Albania with Ballaban under his command. He offered significant prizes to the garrison if they surrendered the fortress, but the garrison responded by bombarding the Ottoman positions. The Ottomans then began to heavily bombard the fortress. In the beginning of July, Skanderbeg sent Pal Angel to Venice. He informed the Venetians that the League continued, and Kruja still stood strong, contrary to rumors that said otherwise. He thus requested the arrival of promised Venetian forces when they signed the Treaty of the Alliance, back on the 20th of August, 1463, and the promised contribution of 3,000 ducats. The Venetians responded that they were already in a difficult situation, due to the Ottoman threat in Dalmatia and the Aegean Sea. They also responded that they had difficulty recruiting new soldiers due to financial trouble, and could only send 1,000 ducats to its proveditors in Albania. Despite these difficulties, the garrison of Kruja continued on resisting. After being convinced that Kruja would not be taken by force, Mehmed left 18,000 cavalry and 5,000 infantry under Ballaban's command. In June of 1466, the Ottoman Sultan withdrew with his main army. He withdrew from the siege towards Gjergj, where the Ottoman Sultan pillaged the area in rage. He also decided to build a powerful fortress in central Albania, to counterbalance Kruja's position, and to form a base for further Ottoman campaigns. Since the Venetian still had not delivered its promised aid, Skanderbeg sent his son John to Venice. Even though the war was at its apogee, John returned from Venice empty-handed. During the 3-month siege, the Albanians had managed to hold the fortress, but the situation was critical. Seeing that no support was arriving, Skanderbeg was forced to travel in Italy, to ask over the provisions in person. Since Paul was Venetian, Ferdinand was also worried that his interests could be inhibited by the Pope, and eventually he didn't send any resources to Skanderbeg until disagreements with his neighbors were resolved. Skanderbeg departed from Naples without any definitive agreement. The Albanian lord would then go to Pope Paul II, after the latter had declared that he had raised 100,000 ducats for the planned crusade. Skanderbeg addressed the Holy See, mentioning his services as a champion of Christ. Paul, however, was still wary of giving Skanderbeg aid, because he reasoned that the Neapolitan threat was more powerful than the Ottoman one. Unlike his predecessors, Paul never attempted to form a crusade against the Ottomans, and instead preferred the use of diplomatic methods. Nevertheless, on a desperate situation, Skanderbeg continued to stay in Rome, hoping that Paul would allocate part of his funds to Albania. During the last weeks of the year in Albania, there was no fighting, since the Ottomans did not normally engage during the winter. But Kruja was still under siege. Life became harder for the population after the destruction of crops and villages, and the mass displacement of the population. By the 22nd of November, news came to Venice about the campaigns of Sinan Bey against Albanian Veneta. The campaign was a ploy to apply pressure to the Venetians to accept a peace with the Ottoman Turks. The Senate was slow to come to terms with Mehmed, due to the pressure by Pope Paul, Hungary, and Naples to remain at war. The attempt to sway the Venetians failed, and the campaign was cancelled. This had an adverse effect for the Ottomans, since Lek Gjergj, an Albanian independent principality, decided to work without reservation with Skanderbeg against the Ottomans. In Rome, the Pope continued to hold Skanderbeg, and would only give him 300 ducats to support his stay. On Christmas Eve, Paul invited Skanderbeg to a ceremony, where he was awarded with a sword and helmet, and referred to him as Alexander, King of the Epirotes. In the beginning of January of 1467, a consistory convened, where the situation in Albania was discussed, but did not result in anything favourable for Skanderbeg. Meanwhile, news coming from Albania were disastrously. His pessimism grew even further when he found out that Venice was now pressuring Paul into refusing Skanderbeg's aid, since they wished to put an end to the war with the Ottomans, and force a capitulation on Kruja. Skanderbeg lost all hope and decided to return to Albania. However, several cardinals convinced him to stay, offering aid from their own pockets, and hope in persuading Paul. A third consistory was convened on the 13th of February, 1467, which, like the other two, came to nothing regarding aid to Skanderbeg. Skanderbeg thus began his departure from Rome. Upon his departure, another messenger came to him stating that the war was nearing its end, and needed Skanderbeg to urgently return to Albania. Before his departure from Italy, Skanderbeg visited Ferdinand once again, but he only received 1,000 ducats and 300 carts of grain. While Skanderbeg was in his court, Ferdinand received an ambassador from Mehmed offering peace, signaling that the Ottomans did not have any aggressive intentions towards Naples. Ferdinand accepted the proposal, and Skanderbeg thus began his return to Albania. Upon returning to Albania, the political situation began to change. The once distant Albanian nobles, among them Lek Gjergj, were now convinced of the absolute leadership of Skanderbeg. Meanwhile, the Venetians ended their attempts to negotiate peace with Mehmed, and began consolidating with Skanderbeg. Skanderbeg met with Gjergj and other northern Albanian nobles in Lecce, where everything began 24 years ago. Lek Gjergj brought 400 horsemen, and a few thousand of infantry. In addition, they were supported by 600 heavily armed Italian soldiers, and 4,000 local Albanians from Gjergj, Shkodër, Lecce, Drivast, and Bar. In total, Skanderbeg commanded 13,400 men. The Albanian counterattack begins now. Skanderbeg and his allies marched through the mouth of the Mat River, and cut through the woods of Ionima to the boundaries of Kruja. The Albanian commanders were assigned on different groups, for an assault on the main Ottoman camp. Manetta's and Gjergj's men would attack the besieging forces from the north, while Skanderbeg's men would attack from south of Kruja, while also blocking any possible Ottoman reinforcements from the east. Skanderbeg first assaulted the guarding force which Ballaban had left, and he gained control of this strategic point. He then managed to defeat the Ottoman relief forces under Ballaban's brother, Yunus, and captured him and his son. 4 days later, an organized attack from Skanderbeg and the forces from Kruja was carried, during which Ballaban forces retreated back to the Ottoman camp. During the retreat, Ballaban Badira was killed in the resulting clashes by Gjergj Leshi. With the death of Ballaban, Ottoman forces were left surrounded. 10,000 men remained in the besieging camp. Those inside the encirclement asked to leave freely towards Ottoman territory, offering to surrender all that was within the camp to the Albanians. Skanderbeg was prepared to accept, but many noblemen refused. Among them was Lek Gjergj, who wanted to attack and destroy the Turkish camp as an act of revenge. The Albanians thus began to annihilate the surrounded army, before the Ottomans cut a narrow path through their opponents and fled through Debra. After almost a year of under siege, the Albanians could finally breathe freely, and on April 23 of 1467, Skanderbeg entered Kruja. Unprecedented in duration and ferocity, this siege proved that even in the most difficult conditions, Albanians could emerge. As a result, the distant Albanian nobles realized that House of Kastrioti was their only hope for independence, and when the Sultan would come back, they would know how to expect him. The victory on Kruja was well received among the Albanians, as Skanderbeg's recruits increased as his camp grew with young warriors from across the region. The victory was also well received in Italy, with contemporaries hoping for more such news. Meanwhile, the Venetians had taken advantage of Mehmed's absence in Albania and sent a fleet under Vettor Capello into the Aegean. Capello's forces occupied the islands of Imbros and Lemnos, after which he sailed back and laid siege to Patras. Omar Bey, the Ottoman commander in Maria, led a relief force to Patras, where he was initially repelled before turning on his pursuers, forcing the Venetians to flee, and thus ending their short-life campaign. After these events, Skanderbeg's forces besieged Elbasan, but failed to capture it because of the lack of artillery and sufficient number of troops. The destruction of Ballaban Pasha's army and the siege of Elbasan forced Sultan Mehmed II to gather another army to lead personally in an attempt to seize Kruja once more. By the summer of 1467, the Ottoman army had entered the region and again set it ablaze. Many peasants and noblemen were killed and enslaved, as the Sultan's wrath seemed unrelenting against the rebels. In addition to Kruja, the Venetian port town of Durazzo was also put under siege by Grand Vizier Mahmud Pasha. Regardless, both sieges were to be unsuccessful, as Turkish artillery was not present in either sieges. However, the degree of destruction was immense. During the Ottoman incursions, the Albanians suffered a great number of casualties, especially to the civilian population, while the economy of the country was in ruins. The above problems, the loss of many Albanian noblemen, and the new alliance with Lek Gjergj caused Skanderbeg to call together in January 1468 all the remaining Albanian noblemen to a conference in the Venetian stronghold of Ljuja to discuss a new war strategy and to restructure what remained from the League. During that period, Skanderbeg fell ill either with malaria or, as it was rumored, from poison. He died on January 17 of 1468. In Western Europe, the death of Skanderbeg was mourned by princes and other rulers such as Ferdinand I. In a condolence letter written to Skanderbeg's widow, Ferdinand expressed pain of having lost his friend and promised assistance to Skanderbeg's family. After Skanderbeg's death, Venice asked and obtained from his widow the permission to defend Kruja with the Venetian garrisons. Kruja held out during its fourth siege, started in 1477 by Ahmed Pasha, until the 16th of June, 1478, when the city was starved to death and finally surrendered. After the fall of Albania to the Ottomans, the Kingdom of Naples gave lands and noble titles to Skanderbeg's family. His family were given control over the Duchy of San Pietro in Garlatina and the county of Salito. Culturally, Skanderbeg came to symbolize the unity and resilience of the Albanian people. In the centuries following his death, particularly during the Albanian national awakening of the 19th century, his figure was revived as national icon.